My name is Dorothy Hindman, and I'm a composer. When I was little, my father managed the Miami classical radio station, and my mother was a trained pianist, so my whole early life I was immersed in classical music. I didn't discover pop music until the 4th grade, and I fell in love with the Beatles, and then in junior high, the Ramones, and then in high school, Led Zeppelin, and in college, grunge. I didn't have any formal training, but I would teach myself the songs by ear on the piano and the guitar. My father would get all kinds of records for the radio station, and I would plunder them looking for pop music, and I found the Moog album in his collection. I listened to it and I thought, that is my instrument. I want to play the synthesizer, which at that time was a very unusual and pretty rare instrument. So I got a job and I saved up money and I bought synthesizers and electric guitars, and I played in rock cover bands in high school and college. I was putting myself through school at Miami-Dade Community College, and that's where I had my first lessons on piano, and thank God they didn't throw me out because I was terrible. But they hired a graduate student from the University of Miami to come over and give me analog synthesizer lessons. And he said, go listen to the recordings from the Columbia Princeton labs from the 50s. But I was blown away and also completely confused, like, what is this? So I would write these electronic music compositions for my lessons, and he said, you should really go and study composition at the University of Miami. So my background is kind of split between really beautiful classical music and music like Led Zeppelin and the Ramones and grunge, which is this noisy, visceral kind of music. And Jimmy Page was my hero, and he did all of those experiments with the theremin and massive reverb and distortion. And I loved how unusual and timbrally based that music was. But it wasn't really until I finished my doctorate that I feel like I found a way to bring those two things together, and it was in this piece for amplified cello. This wonderful cellist friend, Craig Hultgren, who had just gotten a Fender tube amp, which is a typical rock, dirty sounding thing, and he wanted a piece for it. So I wrote a piece for amplified cello called Drowning by Numbers in 1994. The whole piece takes advantage of amplification, and the progressions of the subtle timbral differences are the subject of the work. And it was exploring the cello almost like it's a synthesizer. What are the sounds this can make, and what new musical shapes can I put together from them? I'd been hearing a lot of new music at festivals, and it would go along one way, and then you'd hear a loud, crazy moment, and I would be jolted, thinking, oh, wow, that was great. But then it wouldn't go anywhere, just go back to the same music, and I felt like it was just for shock value. That inspired me to start drowning by numbers with a really aggressive gesture and then just see how far I could take it. It's a 15-minute tour de force, so I'm just going to share some excerpts. The beginning of the piece is super distorted bowed sounds, and it's very rock and roll, relentless repetition of this motive. The middle of the piece features percussive sounds like pizzicato with a guitar pick versus pizzicato with the fingers versus struck with percussion mallets. The end is really quiet sounds, like brushing the strings with the hand, or hammer-ons, or harmonics and glisses. So drowning by numbers is just this really aggressive gesture, and how it eventually dissipates, leaving the greater question, what's the point or role of aggression in music? graduate school, I got really interested in phenomenology and temporality, which helps me to understand how you take a listener through a piece and how they might hear it from moment to moment. As a composer, we can't hear our compositions in the same way as a listener can, because we already know exactly what's going to happen, so it can be hard to tell if we're getting our intentions across. So, musical perception from an interior analysis, to try to understand the listening experience in some kind of general way so that I could use it in a composition, was really important to me. Back then, I wanted above all else to be original, so I had worked out my own approaches to harmony, then to melody, then to form, then to rhythm, etc., and I had this very parametric way of writing. But when it came to my first love of electronic music, I hadn't managed to fit it together with the language and styles of chamber music. I wrote electroacoustic pieces, but it still felt really split, as if it were two different things. In 2006, I discovered the music of the French spectralists Tristan Murail and Gérard Griset. I read everything they wrote, and it was everything I'd been thinking about and working toward. But it also let me make a quantum leap forward in my methods and philosophies. I was able to use my electronic techniques in the most foundational way in my instrumental music. As with Drowning by Numbers, whenever I compose a piece, I'm thinking of the actual people who are going to be playing the piece, their personalities, the things that they like to do, what they look like on stage, etc. As I'm writing the piece, I imagine the player in my mind and think about them actually making the sounds on the instruments. So sound is never separated from the person or object making it for me. It's always attached to a physical image. So it's like I'm not alone when I'm creating. I feel very intimately close to whomever I'm composing for. Even if I don't know the person that's going to play a piece, I just imagine the person. I read a quote from composer Georges Aperkis that captures exactly how I feel, and he was kind enough to let me use it for the lyrics to a piece for the Quince Ensemble called The Fault of Love. I once said the purpose of art is to reflect society. It must be revisited through a new lens with a new perspective, and that lens is art. Pretty much everything I write has some kind of autobiographical aspect to it. But for a long time, I was expressing my thoughts on world events, like the history of Miami and South Florida, where I grew up, and where I came back to live in 2010. In the 2000s and 2010s, I was writing music that was an attempt to tell social justice stories in a way that the news cycle didn't. The TV news reporting used a formulaic approach that dehumanizes the victims and desensitizes the public. And it's called the protest paradigm. I began looking for ways I could somehow bring these stories back in front of the public to make people think again about these issues. So I wrote a number of pieces that sonified objects associated with these stories. For example, when I was very young, my household was chaotic and dangerous, and I would spend a lot of time isolated in my room watching television as a safe escape, and in particular, public television like Electric Company and Sesame Street. In recent years, Sesame Street has added characters embodying social justice issues, like parental incarceration, injured veterans, food and shelter insecurity, and other issues like that. and that Sesame Street would feel a need to create characters that small children who might be suffering these same issues can identify with is a very powerful message about our society. So I wrote 13 for 3 through 5, which transforms and resonifies bits of the Sesame Street theme music that I heard when I was a child, and then the 2 versions of that theme that were current when I watched it again with each of my young sons. When I used to make these very strong musical statements about my political and social opinions, I meant for them to be provocative and for them to be conversations around them. But one conversation was unexpected, and it opened my eyes to the fact that some people in the audience were traumatized themselves. And they weren't focused on the object like a Muppet, but on the tragedy that produced the object, and that could be seen as very exploitative and even damaging, like I'm using somebody's misfortune to profit. And even more so if the stories are not necessarily my own experiences, but are just things I'm reacting to that are happening around me. And that's the last thing that I wanted to do. I'm a white woman, and that conversation set me on a journey of much deeper research and discovery about race, privilege, power, and personal identity. And that feels parallel to the country's journey over the last 4 years. I do authentically have struggles in my past that have shaped me and that I carry with me, including economic insecurity, mental health issues, homelessness, food insecurity, crime, abuse, gun violence, and other issues. So I went back and looked at myself and started asking myself these questions. What are the stories I have the moral authority to tell in my music? What is my identity? What is my personal story? What is my personal power and privilege, and how am I sharing it? And how do I make up for my past mistakes? The last 4 years has been a really different kind of society to reflect. I decided to explore these questions under the self-secluding name Untitled. It's kind of a 180-degree reaction, but I think reflecting deeply on my own identity and my hesitancy to share those reflections publicly, and also the desire to give the audience agency to experience my music however they want to, without imposing my own imagery on it, are all as much a reflection of today's society as anything I've ever written. In the Untitled series, I take my past music and I digitally transform or process it in metaphorical ways, like using echo to imply distance and reverb or distortion for memory, until the piece doesn't resemble the original thing anymore. Then this creates a new sonic model. Then I take that and compose an instrumental chamber version. The sounding result is this very unusual, I think very beautiful music. The first piece in the series, Untitled 1, was an entire piece of mine that I distorted into unrecognizability and made into this other piece. So here's a bit of the sonic model, which is the digitally distorted version of that earlier piece. And then here's an excerpt from the chamber version. Thank you to composers now for indulging my thoughts and presenting my music on their amazing platform. It's an honor, and I recognize it's a privilege to have my voice amplified this way. And I appreciate all Composers Now is doing on behalf of new music.